It's wild how life can feel so perfect one moment, and then shatter into a million pieces the next. Looking back, it's hard to believe I ever thought everything was exactly where it needed to be. My husband and I, we had that dream marriage everyone around us envied. We were the couple that seemed to have it all. 2 kids, a nice house, vacations every summer, and most importantly, we always seemed so connected. It wasn't just a relationship. It felt like a partnership, a real team. We laughed together, supported each other, and truly believed in what we were building. I trusted him with everything I had, and honestly I thought he felt the same way. You know, the kind of trust where you can leave your phone unlocked and not even think twice about it. That was us. No secrets, no worries. But as much as I want to hold on to those moments of happiness, the truth is, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I wish I had seen the cracks sooner. Those tiny hints that something wasn't quite right. It's funny, isn't it? How you can be so sure of your life and your partner, but then, out of nowhere, it all changes. I never saw the betrayal coming. And that's the thing about infidelity. It sneaks up on you in ways you never expect. It doesn't announce itself with flashing lights or sirens. No, it creeps in quietly like a slow-burning fire, until one day, it burns everything down. We had those moments, you know, when we just lie in bed and talk about our dreams for the future. Those sweet, innocent moments where you feel untouchable. I thought we were in it for the long haul. I thought we were invincible. We had our little routines, the comfortable kind, the kind that people never question. The kids' school drop-offs, dinner together, late-night talks. And in the back of my mind there was this sense of security. Nothing can break us, I'd tell myself. But I was wrong. And I didn't realize just how fragile everything really was until it was too late. My husband left me for my sister, and I don't think I'll ever truly get over how unexpected and devastating that betrayal was. In those early days, I kept convincing myself that this was just a rough patch. Marriage has its ups and downs, right? And family drama, well, that happens to everyone. I was naive to think that everything would just fix itself. There's a difference between believing in something and being blind to the truth. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept. The fact that I didn't see it. I didn't see the betrayal coming, not in my wildest dreams. No one ever expects their life to unravel like that. But boy, the cracks were there. Little things like how he'd be less present at home, more distracted when we talked, or how he seemed to get annoyed with me for no real reason. I brushed it off as stress, work pressure, or just the normal ebb and flow of life. You don't want to admit to yourself that things are falling apart. You want to believe that everything is okay, that the love is still there. But when that foundation starts cracking, you can either choose to ignore it or you can face it. And trust me, I wasn't ready to face it. I wish I had known then what I know now. That it's not always the big, obvious signs that tell you something's wrong. Sometimes it's the small, almost invisible things that sneak under your radar, slowly changing the dynamic without you realizing it. And that's exactly how it happened with us. I didn't see it. Not until it was too late. I can still remember the exact moment when things started to feel off. It wasn't some grand event or a loud fight that suddenly opened my eyes. No, it was the little things, the changes so subtle that they almost felt like nothing at all. But once I look back, I realize now that they were the signs I should have noticed. You see, when you're in a relationship, you get used to each other's rhythm, the way you communicate, the tiny gestures that make you feel seen. You become attuned to the usual patterns, and when those patterns start to shift, it's almost like a small earthquake in your emotional landscape, shaking things up in ways you can't ignore, even if you try. First, it was the texts. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, just some innocent messages, right? And sure, that's what I told myself. But there was this strange, subtle shift in how he used his phone. He started being more protective of it, which for us was unusual. We never had issues with privacy. It wasn't like we'd go through each other's phones or keep secrets, but now. He would glance at his screen and quickly lock it whenever I entered the room, like he was trying to hide something. If I asked who he was texting, he'd brush it off with some generic answer like, "Oh, it's work stuff." I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, who wouldn't? We're all busy, right? And a little space here, and there isn't the end of the world. But looking back, that distance, that subtle avoidance, now I see it was a signal. It was the first crack in the relationship. And then there was the way he started pulling away emotionally. Now, don't get me wrong. Every relationship has its ups and downs, its busy seasons where you're both caught up with work or life. But this felt different. It wasn't just a matter of being tired after a long day. It was as though there was an invisible wall between us, something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. He didn't want to talk about anything deeper anymore. The us conversations we used to have, those late-night chats about our dreams, our worries, our plans, those seemed to be fading. He didn't want to share anymore. The jokes that once made us laugh together now felt forced. It was as if every attempt to get closer to him, to break through that emotional distance, was met with resistance. I'd ask, "Are you okay?" And he'd respond with something like, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." But I could tell there was more to it. The problem was, I didn't want to face it. Denial is a funny thing. It makes you hold on to whatever sense of normalcy you can, even when it's slipping right through your fingers. And let's not forget the physical distance. In the beginning, we couldn't keep our hands off each other. There was always this warmth between us, this magnetic pull that kept us connected. We'd share kisses when we woke up, hugs when we'd meet after work, and it felt natural, effortless. But that changed too. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the touch faded. It started with a lack of affection. No more spontaneous hugs or playful gestures. We'd sit next to each other, but it felt like we were miles apart. There were moments when I'd catch myself longing for the physical closeness we once shared, but he seemed content to sit in silence. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't want to believe it. The worst part. The excuses. Oh, the endless excuses. When I'd bring up how we hadn't spent much time together, he'd throw out the classic lines, "I've just been so busy with work," or "I'm just really tired, babe." And at first, I believed him. Who doesn't? We all have our moments when we're burned out, when life feels overwhelming. But as time went on, the excuses became more frequent, and the time spent together less and less. There were nights when I'd sit on the couch waiting for him to come home, only for him to text me that he was going to stay late at work or grab a drink with the guys. I started to wonder, was I imagining things? Was I just being paranoid? But deep down, something told me that it wasn't just stress or tiredness. It felt like he was pulling away, emotionally and physically. And then there was the way he looked at me, or more accurately, the way he didn't look at me anymore. It's hard to explain, but it's as though the sparkle that was once there, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me, was gone. When you've been with someone for so long, you know their gaze, you know the way they look at you when they're in love, when they're proud of you. But that was fading, and I couldn't ignore it. It felt like I was becoming invisible to him. And maybe that's the hardest part of all, realizing that the person you love no longer sees you the same way. But still I held on. I kept telling myself it was just a rough patch. Maybe it was work, maybe it was life, maybe it was just a phase. So, I did what I thought was right. I tried to make things better. I planned little surprises for him, trying to reignite that spark. I took an interest in things he liked. I made more effort with the kids, with the house, with us. But nothing seemed to change. In fact, the more I tried to bring us back to where we were, the further apart we drifted. And that's the moment I should have really paid attention. Because when you try your hardest to fix things, to make them work, but nothing changes, that's when the heartache begins. And that's when I should have asked myself, what's really going on here? But I couldn't. I kept pushing forward, pretending like everything was fine, while the cracks widened in silence. Maybe it was because I was scared. Scared of confronting the painful truth that our relationship, the one I thought was so solid, was actually crumbling. It's hard to admit, but I was too afraid to see what was right in front of me. I wish I had noticed it all sooner. But maybe, just maybe, I wasn't supposed to. Maybe it took the eventual betrayal to open my eyes to all the subtle signs I ignored. And now, looking back, I know I should have trusted myself more. I should have listened to that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me something wasn't right. But hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it? If I had known then what I know now, maybe I could have stopped it all before it spiraled into something much worse. But here's the thing. Life doesn't always give you the answers up front. It doesn't hand you a neat little package with a bow on top. No, it's messy. And when betrayal rears its ugly head, it doesn't wait for you to be ready. And when that truth finally hits you, when the reality of the situation sinks in, that's when everything changes. That's when the emotional pain sets in, and you have to face the consequences of everything that's been happening behind your back. I still remember the exact moment everything changed. The moment the perfect illusion of my life crumbled into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't just a discovery. It was a shock, a heart-shattering revelation that left me gasping for air. There are moments in life that you never forget, moments so vivid that they burn into your memory like an indelible mark. This was one of those moments. I had been going through a regular day. Well, as regular as it could be at that point when I found out the truth. It was the kind of truth that hits you like a freight train. You think you're prepared for it, but then it blindsides you, knocking the breath right out of your lungs. It started out innocently enough. I was home alone, scrolling through my phone, looking for something to distract me. And that's when I saw the message. First, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first time I'd gone through my husband's phone. After all, we'd always been transparent with each other. But this time there was something different. Something about the way he had hidden a particular conversation caught my eye. Maybe it was the way he had locked it behind a password I didn't recognize. Something in me told me to look deeper. And I wish I had ignored that gut feeling. But I didn't. Opened it. And what I saw left me frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. There, in black and white, was the painful truth. A text conversation between my husband and my sister. It wasn't just friendly chit-chat or innocent exchanges about family matters either. No, it was much worse. The texts were full of affection, compliments, and then as I scrolled further down, there it was, clear as day. Plans for a secret meeting, intimate exchanges that made my heart sink into my stomach. They had been seeing each other behind my back. My sister, the person I trusted most in this world, had been the one who tore apart everything I had built with my husband. The betrayal hit me like a slap in the face. It was as if everything around me suddenly came crashing down, and I was too stunned to do anything about it. The emotions hit all at once. Shock, disbelief, rage, and most of all, heartbreak. I couldn't process it. I wanted to scream, cry, throw up. But I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of it all. I had always trusted my husband. I had always trusted my sister. I had always believed in the bond of sisterhood, in the idea that no one would ever do something like this. And yet, here I was, staring at the painful truth of their betrayal, wondering how it could have all been so easy for them to hide. How long had this been going on? Had I missed the signs? Were they laughing at me behind my back all this time? The questions ran wild in my mind, but no answers came. Only silence. And that silence was deafening. I remember feeling like my world was spinning out of control. Could hardly breathe. I had no idea what to do next. I had so many questions but no one to ask. The trust one had in both of them was shattered in an instant, and in its place was a deep, aching pain that I couldn't even begin to describe. How could this happen? How could they both do this to me? It wasn't just about the affair itself. It was about everything that had led up to it. The lies, the deceit, the emotional manipulation. It was all too much to handle. I was overwhelmed by the depth of the betrayal, and for a moment, I honestly thought I might lose my mind. In the hours that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the pain they had caused me. The pain they had caused our family. I thought about all the good times we had shared, all the memories we had created together, and it all felt like a lie. How could it all have been so real and so fake at the same time? I couldn't make sense of it. And as much as I wanted to confront both of them right then and there, I knew I needed time to gather myself. But no amount of time could prepare me for the conversation that was about to come. And then there was the guilt. The gut-wrenching guilt that washed over me. How could I have not seen this coming? How could I have missed the signs? Had I been so blinded by my own love for them that I allowed this to happen? The emotional scars of betrayal are not just caused by the act itself. They are also fueled by the endless what-ifs that follow. What if I had trusted my instincts earlier? What if I had confronted them sooner? What if I had seen the warning signs before everything went so terribly wrong? But those thoughts only lead to more heartache and regret, and at that moment, all I could focus on was the immediate pain of knowing that the two people I loved most in the world had hurt me beyond repair. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, and I certainly never imagined that my sister, my own flesh and blood, would be the one to betray me like this. The love triangle that had developed between my husband and my sister was something I never could have prepared for. It felt like the ultimate family conflict, a betrayal of trust that went deeper than anything I had ever known. I wanted to scream, I wanted to fight, but I was too crushed to move. How do you confront two people who've shattered your entire sense of self-worth? How do you find the strength to stand up when the pain is so overwhelming? The hardest part was the realization that I had to face the truth. I had to confront the painful reality that the people I thought I could count on most were the very ones who had broken me. I had to come to terms with the fact that my life would never be the same again. The emotional recovery from something like this is no easy feat, and in that moment, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of heartache and betrayal. There was no way to undo what had been done, and that knowledge was enough to send anyone into an emotional spiral. But somehow I had to find a way to survive it, because if I didn't, I would lose myself completely. The moment had finally come. I had seen enough, and I couldn't avoid it any longer. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. How would I confront them? What would I say? How could I possibly put into words the devastation I was feeling? They had both been a part of my life for so long, and yet in the blink of an eye, everything I thought I knew about them was ripped away. The betrayal was so deep, so personal. It felt as though a knife had been twisted in my chest. My heart was heavy with emotion, but one thing was certain. I needed to face the truth, even if it broke me further. And facing them meant confronting the painful reality of what had happened between my husband and my sister. I remember that evening vividly, the quiet before the storm. I had asked them to meet me at the house, my husband and sister both oblivious to what I knew. I didn't know exactly how to approach them, but I had reached a breaking point. No more pretending. No more silence. I was tired of living in the unknown, of hiding from what was right in front of me. I had to confront them not just for myself, but for the life I had thought we were building together. As they walked into the living room, I could feel the tension in the air. There was a heaviness that surrounded us, something neither of them could ignore, though neither one seemed to understand the full weight of what was about to happen. At first I didn't say anything. Couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, tangled up with all the emotions I was struggling to process. My eyes scanned both of them. My husband, who I had once trusted beyond measure, and my sister, who I had loved like no one else. I could see the nervousness in their eyes, the way they avoided looking at me directly. They both knew something was off, but neither one could have imagined what I knew. My heart raced as I finally broke the silence. "You both owe me an explanation," I said, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall, but I wasn't going to let that stop me from speaking the truth. "I know what's been going on. I know about you too." The shock on their faces was almost too much to bear. My husband's face went pale, and for a moment, it looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. My sister, on the other hand, just stared at me in disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend what I was saying. For a second, I wondered if they would try to deny it. But the truth was undeniable. The texts, the lies, the secret meetings, they had all come out into the open, and there was no escaping it now. Felt like the world had stopped spinning. I could feel the emotional scars of betrayal starting to surface, but I had to keep my composure. I couldn't let them see how broken I truly was. I had to confront them with the painful truth, even if it meant facing my worst fears. My husband was the first to speak. His voice was low, almost pleading. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." A mistake. How could he say that? How could he call something so deep, so damaging a mistake? My whole life had been built around him, around us. And here he was, downplaying it as if it was some minor lapse in judgment. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much he had shattered our family. But I held back, my anger simmering beneath the surface. Then it was my sister's turn. She looked at me, her face flushed with guilt, but I could see the shame in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened. It just happened. Just happened." How could she possibly say that? How could she explain away something so painful, so deliberate, as if it was some kind of accident? My sister, the person who was supposed to stand by me, had knowingly crossed the line. And in doing so, she had destroyed more than just my marriage. She had destroyed the trust between us, the bond we had shared for years. The words they spoke didn't matter. They were just empty excuses, hollow apologies that did nothing to heal the wounds they had caused. I didn't need to hear their apologies. I needed them to understand the depth of their betrayal. I needed them to feel the pain that I was feeling, the heartbreak that had torn through my chest. But nothing they said could make me feel better. Nothing they said could undo the damage they had done. The emotional pain of betrayal is like a wound that doesn't heal. It lingers, and no matter how much you try to patch it up, the scar will always be there. As the confrontation continued, the emotional turmoil inside me grew. How could they stand there and act like nothing had changed? How could they look me in the eye and try to justify what they had done? Every word they spoke felt like another slap in the face, another reminder that I had been blind to the truth for so long. I felt like a fool, standing there listening to them try to explain away the betrayal. But I wasn't a fool. I was someone who had been deeply hurt by the people I loved most, and I had every right to be angry, to be devastated, to feel utterly betrayed. I couldn't bring myself to forgive them. Not then, not in that moment. The emotional scars were too deep. I had to distance myself from them, from the toxic energy they brought into my life. And yet, despite the pain, there was a part of me that still wanted to believe in them. I wanted to believe that the bond of family could survive this, that somehow we could rebuild what had been broken. But I also knew that trust, once shattered, is nearly impossible to repair. And the betrayal of trust, especially when it comes from those closest to you, is something that stays with you forever. It was a gut-wrenching reality, but it was the truth. And now I had to find a way to process it. I had to find a way to move forward, to heal from the emotional devastation that had been inflicted upon me. The confrontation wasn't the end of my pain. It was just the beginning. I still had so much to figure out, so much to process. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living in the shadows of their lies. I had to start rebuilding my life, no matter how difficult that might be. When I found out the truth about my husband and my sister, it felt like the floor had been ripped out from beneath me. But what was even more devastating than the discovery itself was learning the full extent of their betrayal. At first I had only seen fragments, the texts, the whispered conversations, the late-night meetings, but the more I uncovered, the deeper the deceit went. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment, a mistake. No, this was a calculated, ongoing betrayal. My mind struggled to process how long it had been going on, how many lies had been told, and how much of our relationship had been built on nothing but falsehoods. I had always prided myself on being open, on being someone who trusted completely, because I believed that trust was the foundation of any strong relationship. But my husband had shattered that trust, and so had my sister. The more I found out, the more I realized just how deeply they had betrayed me, not just as a wife, but as a sister, as a woman who had given them everything. It wasn't just the affair itself. It was everything that surrounded it. The lies, the hidden conversations, the secret meetings. They had been living a double life, one that I was never even aware of, all while I was left in the dark, trusting them with every part of me. What hurt the most was the realization that my sister, my own flesh and blood, had been complicit in this all along. She had chosen to go behind my back, to deceive me, and to tear apart the very foundation of our family. It wasn't just the affair with my husband that hurt. It was the fact that my sister had been a willing participant in it. She knew what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. And yet she continued. I couldn't comprehend it. How could she do this to me? To us? How could she betray the bond of sisterhood in such a profound way? The trust that I had in her, the belief that we were family, those things had been destroyed in an instant. And it wasn't just my sister. My husband's role in this betrayal was equally devastating. The fact that he had been the one to initiate it, to reach out to my sister in the first place, shattered my sense of who he was. We had always been a team, or at least I thought we had been. We shared our dreams, our fears, our lives. And yet, in the background, he had been quietly plotting, deceiving me, all while continuing to play the role of the loving husband. How long had this been going on? How many times had he lied to me, told me he was working late or out with friends, when in reality he was with my sister, betraying me in the most intimate way possible? The thought of it made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe that the man I had trusted with everything had been capable of such a betrayal. As the details of their deception unfolded, I found myself overwhelmed by a wave of emotions: anger, disbelief, sadness. But what cut the deepest was the feeling of being utterly blindsided. I had always been the kind of person who trusted without hesitation, who believed in the goodness of those closest to me. But now I felt like a fool. I had been so focused on building our life together, on making things work, that I had ignored the warning signs. I had ignored the subtle hints that something wasn't right. And by the time I figured it out, it was too late. The damage had already been done. I had always thought that the most painful part of betrayal would be the act itself. The affair, the kiss, the betrayal of trust. But what I learned in that moment was that the true depth of deception goes far beyond the physical act. It's about the lies that are told, the emotional manipulation that takes place, the years of secrecy that are kept from you. It's about the trust that is shattered, not just in one person but in everyone involved. I had trusted my sister with my heart, and my husband with my soul. And yet, both of them had been lying to me all along. The emotional scars from this kind of betrayal are not something that can be easily healed. They run deep and they take time to process. And every time I thought I had started to move on, something else would come up. Another piece of the puzzle, another detail that I had missed. It felt like I was drowning in a sea of lies, with no way to escape. But the more I learned about their betrayal, the more I realized just how much I needed to heal. I couldn't keep living in this emotional turmoil. I couldn't keep torturing myself with the details of their deception. I had to find a way to let go of the anger, the hurt, and the betrayal, even if it felt impossible. As much as I wanted to focus on the pain, on the emotional devastation they had caused me, I also knew that I had to find a way forward. I couldn't keep looking back, couldn't keep dwelling on the past. The betrayal was real, and it was painful, but it was also an opportunity for me to rediscover who I was, to rebuild my life, to reclaim my sense of self-worth. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But if I was going to move on, if I was going to heal, I had to confront the full scope of what had happened. I had to face the depth of their deception and learn to accept it. Only then could I begin to rebuild my life. The aftermath of discovering the betrayal was unlike anything I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the loss of my marriage. It was the loss of two people who were supposed to be the most important in my life. My husband, the man I had chosen to build a future with, and my sister, the one person I had trusted more than anyone else. Together, they didn't just tear apart my marriage. They tore apart the very foundation of my family. And in doing so, they left me with a kind of emptiness that I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just the heartbreak of losing my husband. It was the pain of realizing that the person I thought I could always rely on, my own sister, was capable of such a betrayal. In the beginning, I couldn't even begin to process what had happened. I felt as though I was living in a fog, unable to think clearly, unable to understand the full scope of what had taken place. There was so much pain, so much anger, and yet, it was all tangled up in confusion and disbelief. How could they both have done this to me? To us? How could they have knowingly destroyed everything we had built together? The emotional toll was overwhelming. I had never felt so alone in my life, and I felt as though the walls of my world were closing in on me. And then came the guilt. The crushing guilt that gnawed at my insides, making me question everything about my life, my choices, and my role in the betrayal. What had I done wrong? Had I not been enough for my husband? Had I somehow failed him? And with my sister, the guilt was even worse. How could I have been so blind to what was happening right under my nose? I had trusted her with everything. I had shared my deepest secrets, my fears, my dreams. And she had taken all of that and betrayed me in the most unforgivable way possible. The weight of that guilt was almost unbearable. It felt as though I was carrying the burden of their actions on my shoulders, even though I was the one who had been wronged. But the hardest part, the part that I couldn't seem to escape, was the deep sense of loss. Losing my husband was painful enough. I had invested so much of my heart into our relationship, so much of my future, that the idea of a life without him seemed unimaginable. But losing my sister, that was a different kind of pain altogether. The betrayal from her cut so deep because it wasn't just the loss of a sibling, it was the loss of the connection, the trust, the bond that we had shared. It wasn't just a marriage that was broken, it was a family. And that hurt in a way I couldn't explain. Family is supposed to be the one constant in your life, the one thing you can always rely on, no matter what. But now it felt like everything I had believed in had been shattered. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I remember spending days in a state of numbness, not knowing how to move forward. The weight of the betrayal was so heavy that I didn't even know where to start. How could I face the world again? How could I trust anyone, let alone my own family? It was as if I had been stripped of everything that gave me strength. My marriage, my sister, my sense of security. And with that loss came an overwhelming sense of isolation. I felt completely alone, as though no one could possibly understand the pain I was going through. No one could understand what it felt like to have both the person you loved and the person you trusted most in the world betray you at the same time. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, something started to change. Slowly, I began to realize that the pain I was feeling was not just a result of their betrayal. It was a result of the loss of my own identity. For so long I had defined myself by my relationship with my husband and my bond with my sister. But when they both left me, I was forced to face the fact that I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know what I wanted, what I needed, or how to move forward. I had been so consumed by my relationships with them that I had forgotten about myself. And that was something I had to rediscover. I started to allow myself to grieve, not just for the loss of my marriage or my sister, but for the loss of the person I had once been. I needed to mourn that version of myself, the one who had been so deeply connected to them, the one who had trusted so completely. And through that grief, I began to realize that it was okay to feel broken. It was okay to feel lost. But it wasn't okay to stay there. I couldn't let the betrayal define me, even though it had taken so much from me. In that grief, I began to understand something important. That grieving isn't just about the people you lose, it's about the parts of yourself that you have to let go of in the process. It's about coming to terms with the emotional pain and the heartbreak, and allowing yourself the space to heal. But healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, painful process. And sometimes the pain of losing your marriage and your sister never really goes away. Something you carry with you, but over time you learn to live with it. You learn to rebuild your life, one step at a time, even if it feels impossible. It's hard to explain how it happens, but gradually, I started to feel something shift within me. It wasn't a magic moment where everything was suddenly better. It wasn't like the pain went away instantly. But I started to realize that I wasn't broken beyond repair. I wasn't defined by their betrayal. I was still me, and I could still rebuild. I could still move forward. And even though the emotional scars of betrayal would always be a part of me, I began to see them as part of my story, not the end of it. Yes, the pain was real, and yes, the heartbreak was devastating, but it didn't have to be the thing that controlled my life. I had to take back control. I had to grieve, yes, but I also had to heal. After the discovery of my husband's betrayal with my sister, the following days felt like an endless storm. The weight of everything crashing down on me left me in a state of emotional paralysis. There were moments when I couldn't even get out of bed, when the thought of facing the world outside felt like an insurmountable task. My once bright world had turned into a dark, empty space, and all I could do was try to hold on to some shred of sanity. The pain of being betrayed by the two people I trusted the most felt like a wound that refused to heal. I felt like I was drowning in my own heartbreak, and the worst part was, I didn't know how to make it stop. Emotional breakdowns became a frequent companion. I'd find myself crying at the most unexpected times, sitting in the car, in the shower, or even while making dinner for the kids. The tears wouldn't stop. They were as much a part of me as my breath, flowing endlessly, without any sense of control. First, I tried to fight it. I didn't want to let the world see how broken I was. But eventually, I realized that I couldn't keep pretending. The emotional toll of betrayal runs deep, and sometimes you can't just push it away. You have to face it head-on, even if it feels like you're being consumed by it. I felt utterly isolated. Sure, I had friends who tried to offer support, but the pain was so personal, so unique to my experience, that I couldn't explain it to anyone. How could I? How could I explain what it felt like to be betrayed by my own sister? By the man I had shared my life with. They couldn't possibly understand the depth of that hurt. And no amount of sympathy or kind words could fill the empty space I now found myself in. It was a loneliness unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of people around me, it was the absence of trust, the absence of connection. The two people who should have been my safe havens had betrayed me in the most gut-wrenching way. I didn't know where to turn, who to talk to, or how to make sense of any of it. There were nights when I would lie awake, my mind racing, unable to silence the storm inside me. I'd replay every moment with my husband and my sister, trying to make sense of it all, searching for any sign that I had missed. The why questions would never stop. Why did he cheat? Why did she do this to me? Had I done something wrong? And then the self-doubt would creep in. Was I not enough? Had I failed them both in some way? The pain was consuming, and it felt like it would never end. The emotional pain of betrayal is like an anchor, weighing you down, keeping you tethered to your past, and for a while I couldn't imagine a future without it. During this time, I isolated myself even further. I didn't want to be around anyone who could see my pain. I didn't want to explain myself, to justify my sadness, or to hear the well-meaning but unhelpful comments from those who didn't really understand. It'll get better. I heard that a lot. But how could I believe that? How could I move on from something so devastating? So many times I found myself pushing people away, afraid that if I let anyone too close, they'd see the depths of my despair, the dark place I had fallen into. But even in the darkest moments, something inside me kept pushing back against the overwhelming sadness. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as though, buried under the weight of my grief, there was a tiny flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me from completely giving up. I realized that while I couldn't escape the isolation or the heartache, I also couldn't let it define me. I had to find a way to survive this. I had to find a way to heal, even if it felt impossible. In some ways, the darkest moments were also the most important. They were the moments when I had to face myself, when I had to reckon with the betrayal and the loss. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen quickly, but those moments of emotional breakdown also forced me to reckon with who I was outside of my marriage and family. I had spent so long identifying myself as a wife, a sister, a mother. But now, with all those labels stripped away, I had to rediscover who I was. And it was in the silence, in the loneliness, that I began to realize that I still had the strength to fight. It wasn't a fight against them or even against the betrayal. It was a fight for myself, for my healing. Yes, there were days when I felt like I would never emerge from the darkness. Days when the emotional scars felt too fresh, too raw, too painful. But each tear I cried, each moment of pain was a step toward recovery. Healing doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without a fight. But eventually, I began to realize that the pain would not control me forever. It might be a part of my story, but it would not be the whole story. I had to give myself permission to feel all of it, the heartache, the anger, the betrayal, while also allowing myself the space to heal. And little by little, the fog began to lift. It didn't happen all at once, but I started to see glimpses of light again. I started to feel like I could breathe again, like the weight on my chest wasn't as heavy. The pain was still there, but it didn't feel quite so suffocating. The emotional scars would always be with me, but they wouldn't define me. I would rebuild not just my life but my sense of self. And while I wasn't fully healed yet, I knew that I was taking the first steps toward a future beyond the betrayal, beyond the heartache. Moving on from the betrayal was not something that could happen overnight. It wasn't like flipping a switch, where suddenly everything was fine and I was healed. No, it was a slow, painstaking process, one that tested every ounce of strength I had left in me. The emotional toll that the betrayal took on me was so profound that, at times, it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. How could I ever pick up the pieces of my life when everything had been shattered into a million fragments? In the early days after the confrontation, I struggled to even think about the future. How could I look ahead when the past seemed to haunt me at every turn? How could I move on from the deep emotional scars of betrayal when every part of my life had been turned upside down? Every morning, I woke up with this feeling of dread, a heavy emptiness that lingered throughout the day. I would go through the motions, work, home, caring for the kids, but it felt like I was living someone else's life, a life that had been stolen from me. I no longer knew who I was, and I certainly didn't know how to put the pieces of my heart back together. The hardest part of moving on was learning how to trust again. Trust had been the foundation of my relationship with both my husband and my sister, and now that foundation was gone. It wasn't just about trusting them, it was about trusting myself, trusting my instincts, and trusting that I could protect my heart from further harm. For so long I had been so open, so giving, so willing to believe the best in the people I loved. But now I questioned everything. How could I ever trust anyone again, let alone trust my own judgment? The emotional pain of that loss was one of the most difficult things I had to face. There were times when I wondered if I'd ever be able to rebuild my life, or if I was forever going to be defined by the betrayal. It felt like an endless struggle, one that I wasn't sure I had the strength to win. But little by little, I began to realize that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending like the betrayal never happened. Moving on meant finding a way to heal, to rebuild, and to reclaim my life despite the hurt. It meant accepting that the past could not be changed, but that I had the power to shape my future. And as difficult as it was, I had to start by accepting the pain and letting it guide me forward, rather than letting it keep me stuck in the past. One of the first steps in moving on was learning how to set boundaries. I had to stop allowing myself to be dragged back into the emotional chaos of the betrayal. I couldn't keep reliving the hurt every time I saw my husband or sister, and I couldn't allow their actions to continue to hold power over me. This meant distancing myself from them, even though it felt like the hardest thing in the world. But I knew that if I didn't, I would never be able to heal. Setting boundaries wasn't about being cruel or cutting them out of my life forever. It was about protecting myself, about giving myself the space I needed to process the pain and to start rebuilding. The struggle to move on also meant taking a hard look at myself. I had to confront the parts of me that had allowed the betrayal to happen. Not that I was to blame for their actions, but I had to own my part in the relationship, my role in the dynamic that had led to such a painful outcome. This didn't mean blaming myself. It meant understanding where I had gone wrong, where I had neglected my own needs, and where I had let things slide in order to keep the peace. It was a difficult realization, but one that I had to face in order to heal. There were also the small, everyday struggles of trying to find joy again. When everything had been so dark, so painful, it felt impossible to imagine a life where happiness was possible again. I remember feeling guilty when I had moments of joy, when I laughed, when I felt something positive. I would feel this nagging guilt, as if I wasn't allowed to be happy after everything that had happened. But eventually I learned that it was okay to feel joy again. I had every right to find happiness, to rebuild my life, and to create new experiences for myself. The betrayal didn't define me, and I wasn't going to let it control my future. I had to give myself permission to move forward, even if it felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. The other aspect of moving on was learning to prioritize my own happiness. For so long I had been focused on making everyone else happy, on being the perfect wife, the perfect sister, the perfect mother. But in doing so, I had neglected myself. I had neglected my own needs, my own desires, and my own well-being. Moving on meant putting myself first, learning to love myself again, and doing things that made me feel good, even if they were small steps. Whether it was taking a walk in the park, reading a book, or spending time with friends who truly cared about me, I began to rediscover what made me feel whole. And slowly I started to rebuild. It wasn't a straight line, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were days when the pain still felt unbearable, when the emotional scars were fresh and raw. But over time, I started to realize that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I had been through hell, but I was still standing. And with each passing day, I learned how to take back control of my life, my heart, and my future. Moving on wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about choosing to keep going despite it. It was about acknowledging the pain, but not letting it be the end of my story. Forgiveness. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, especially when it comes to betrayal. People say it's the key to healing, that it's the only way to truly move on from the pain. But when you've been betrayed in the most intimate way possible, when the people you loved and trusted the most have broken you, forgiveness doesn't feel so simple. It doesn't feel like something you can just hand out, especially not when the emotional wounds are so fresh. For me, the question wasn't just about whether I should forgive them, it was about whether I could. In the days following the discovery of the affair, I felt consumed by anger. It was like a fire inside me, burning uncontrollably. How could they have done this to me? How could they betray me like this, knowing how much I loved and trusted them? At first, forgiveness seemed impossible. It felt like giving them the benefit of the doubt, like saying that their actions didn't matter, that they were excused. And honestly, I didn't feel like they deserved that kind of grace. My husband had been the person I had built my life with, and my sister was the one person who should have had my back, no matter what. The idea of forgiving them for what they did felt like a betrayal to myself. How could I forgive them when I was still drowning in emotional pain, when their actions had left scars that seemed too deep to heal? But the longer I sat with my anger and resentment, the more I realized that it was eating me alive. Anger, I've learned, is a heavy burden to carry. It clouds your judgment, it poisons your thoughts, and it prevents you from moving forward. The anger I felt toward my husband and sister was completely justified, but I also knew that holding on to that anger wasn't helping me. In fact, it was only keeping me tied to them, keeping me chained to the past. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew that in order to truly heal, I had to find a way to let go of the bitterness. Now, let me be clear. Letting go of anger doesn't mean excusing their behavior. It doesn't mean saying that what they did was okay, or that I was willing to forget the betrayal. It simply meant that I was choosing not to let their actions define my future. I was choosing to take control of my healing, rather than allowing the betrayal to control me. But that wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. One thing I had to learn in this process was that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. For a long time I thought that in order to forgive, I had to let my husband and sister back into my life. I thought that if I forgave them, everything would go back to normal. But that's not how it works. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to trust them again, or that you have to put yourself in a position to be hurt again. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the emotional chains that hold you back. It's about letting go of the anger, the resentment, and the hurt that are keeping you stuck. But that doesn't mean you have to allow them back into your life, especially if they haven't proven that they can be trusted again. As I started to let go of the anger, I also had to confront the feelings of guilt that came with the idea of forgiveness. I felt guilty for even considering forgiving them. It felt like I was letting them off the hook, like I was making excuses for their actions. But the truth was, holding on to that guilt wasn't helping me either. It was keeping me stuck in a cycle of pain, and it was preventing me from moving forward. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about them, it was about me. It was about freeing myself from the emotional turmoil that was consuming me. And the only way to do that was to make peace with the situation, to accept that what happened was wrong, but that I couldn't change it. Forgiveness also didn't happen all at once. It was a slow process, and there were times when I felt like I was taking one step forward and two steps back. Some days I felt ready to forgive, while other days, the anger would come rushing back. But over time, I started to see that forgiveness didn't have to be a one-time event. It was an ongoing process, a choice I had to make every day. And eventually, I realized that forgiving them didn't mean I was weak or that I was excusing their behavior. It meant that I was strong enough to take control of my own healing, and I was choosing to move forward with my life, rather than staying trapped in the past. The more I thought about forgiveness, the more I came to understand that it wasn't a favor I was doing for them, it was a favor I was doing for myself. By holding on to my anger and resentment, I was letting their betrayal control my emotional state. But by forgiving, I was taking back control. I was choosing peace over pain. And I realized that I didn't have to forgive them to make everything right. I had to forgive them to make peace with myself. And even though forgiveness was difficult, even though it didn't come easily, I began to feel lighter. I began to feel like I could breathe again. The emotional weight I had carried for so long started to lift, and I realized that, in some ways, forgiving them was the key to my own freedom. It didn't mean that everything was perfect. It didn't mean that I was ready to reconcile with them, or that I would ever forget what had happened. But it meant that I was no longer going to allow their betrayal to define me. And that, in itself, was the most freeing feeling in the world. As time passed and I slowly began to heal, something remarkable started to happen. I began to realize that the woman I was before the betrayal, before the heartache, before the emotional devastation, was no longer who I was. That woman, the one who had relied so heavily on her relationships to define her, had been broken down to nothing. But from those broken pieces, something new began to emerge. Something stronger. Something independent. At first, I didn't recognize the changes. They were subtle, like tiny cracks forming in an old wall, too small to notice at first but eventually widening as time went on. I started to take more time for myself, to focus on my own needs, my own desires. For so long I had put everyone else first. My husband, my sister, my family. I had centered my world around them, and in doing so, I had lost sight of who I was. But now, for the first time in years, I was starting to remember who I was outside of those roles. I wasn't just a wife, or a sister, or a mother. I was me, an individual with dreams and goals of my own. This new sense of independence wasn't easy to embrace. For a long time, I had depended on the validation and love of others to feel worthy. I had tied my self-worth to my relationships. When those relationships fell apart, it felt like the very foundation of my identity had crumbled with them. But as I started to rebuild, I realized that I didn't need anyone else to validate my worth. I was worthy on my own. I had always been worthy on my own. I had just forgotten that. There was something empowering about reclaiming my life, about rediscovering my own strength. I started to make decisions based on what I wanted, not based on what others expected of me. I began to make time for the things that brought me joy, whether it was reading, exercising, or just spending time with people who truly cared about me. I was no longer afraid to take up space in the world. I wasn't afraid to put myself first anymore, to say no when something didn't serve me. I realized that I didn't owe anyone anything except the best version of myself. One of the biggest changes I noticed was in how I viewed love and relationships. Before the betrayal, I had put all my energy into trying to make things work with my husband. I had believed in the idea of us above everything else, and I had sacrificed my own happiness in the process. But now I saw relationships differently. I understood that in order to truly love someone else, I first had to love and respect myself. I wasn't willing to compromise my self-worth for anyone. If a relationship didn't honor who I was, it wasn't worth my time. I wasn't afraid to walk away from anything or anyone that didn't add value to my life. And that was liberating. I realized that my happiness wasn't tied to someone else's actions or choices. It was tied to my own ability to choose happiness for myself. Through this journey of self-discovery, I also learned how to set stronger boundaries. I had spent so many years allowing myself to be pushed around, letting people overstep, letting my own needs go unmet because I was afraid of rocking the boat. But I had learned the hard way that boundaries weren't just a nice thing to have. They were essential for my emotional survival. I had to protect my heart, my time, and my energy. Setting boundaries wasn't about being selfish or rigid. It was about valuing myself enough to say no when necessary, and about surrounding myself with people who respected those boundaries. But perhaps the most powerful shift was in how I started to view my own resilience. When I had first learned about the betrayal, I had felt like my world was crumbling, like I would never be able to recover. The pain felt unbearable, and I couldn't see a way out. But as I began to heal, I started to realize that I was far stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I had survived the worst heartbreak I could imagine, and I was still standing. I had been through a betrayal that rocked me to my core, and yet I had come out the other side with a deeper sense of strength, of self-worth, and of purpose. I realized that nothing, no matter how painful, could ever truly break me. I had survived, and I would continue to survive. I wasn't just healing, I was growing. I was evolving into the woman I was always meant to be. Embracing my new strength and independence wasn't a smooth journey, and it wasn't without its struggles. There were moments when I doubted myself, moments when I wondered if I was strong enough to move forward. But with every challenge I faced, I proved to myself that I was. I was stronger than my past, stronger than the betrayal, and stronger than I had ever known. The pain would always be a part of my story, but it no longer controlled me. I was the one in control now. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I began to look ahead with hope, not just because I knew I could heal, but because I knew I had the power to create the life I wanted. The emotional scars from the betrayal would always be there, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a reminder of how far I had come. And with each passing day, I grew more confident in my ability to rebuild, to find love again, whether it was with another person or, more importantly, with myself. Looking back, I can now see that the betrayal, as painful as it was, taught me some of the most valuable lessons of my life. At first, it felt like my world had fallen apart, and I struggled to find any meaning in the hurt, the heartbreak, and the loss. But over time, I began to realize that this experience was shaping me into a stronger, wiser, and more self-aware person. It was teaching me things I had never truly understood before. Things about love, trust, self-worth, and the importance of personal boundaries. It wasn't easy to accept, but I came to understand that pain, while excruciating, has a way of reshaping us, of forcing us to confront the things we would rather avoid. One of the first and most important lessons I learned was about the value of trust. Before the betrayal, I had trusted my husband and my sister implicitly. Trust was something I gave freely, and I believed in the idea that relationships could thrive on mutual respect and honesty. But when that trust was shattered, I had to reevaluate what it really meant to trust someone, and whether or not it was wise to give my trust so easily. I learned that trust must be earned, not just given away freely, and that it's okay to be cautious when it comes to your heart. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it can take a long time to rebuild. But more importantly, I learned that I needed to trust myself. My instincts, my judgment, my ability to see the truth even when I didn't want to. Trusting myself became one of the most empowering things I could do. I realized that I could protect myself from further hurt if I was willing to listen to my own voice. Another critical lesson I learned was the importance of self-worth. For so long I had defined myself through my relationships. I was a wife, a sister, a mother. And in doing so, I often lost sight of who I was as an individual. The betrayal forced me to confront the fact that I had been neglecting my own needs, my own desires, and my own well-being. I had put the needs of others first, often at the expense of my own happiness. But as I started to heal, I began to realize that I had to put myself first. I had to value myself, regardless of how anyone else treated me. My worth wasn't tied to my role as a wife or a sister. It was intrinsic. I am worthy simply because I exist. And that was a lesson I needed to learn. I had to unlearn the belief that my happiness depended on someone else's approval or love. I had to build my self-worth from within. The betrayal also taught me about the power of setting boundaries. Before everything fell apart, I had always been a people pleaser. I didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to cause conflict, so I would often allow others to overstep my personal boundaries. But after the betrayal, I realized how important it is to set clear boundaries with the people in your life. Boundaries aren't just about saying no to things you don't want. They're about protecting your emotional energy, your heart, and your well-being. I learned that it's okay to put yourself first, to say no when something doesn't align with your values, and to create space for your own needs. It wasn't easy at first, but over time, I began to see how healthy boundaries could help me reclaim my life and my sense of self. I no longer felt guilty for prioritizing my own needs. In fact, I learned that it was essential for my emotional survival. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all was the realization that I had the power to choose my own path forward. For so long, I had been caught in the cycle of pain, resentment, and anger. I had allowed the betrayal to define me, to shape my identity. But as time passed, I began to understand that I didn't have to stay in that place of hurt. I could choose to heal, to rebuild, and to move forward. This experience taught me that while we can't control the actions of others, we can control how we respond to them. I could choose to let the betrayal consume me, or I could choose to rise above it. And though it wasn't easy, I chose to rise. I chose to rebuild my life, to reclaim my happiness, and to learn from the pain, rather than allowing it to define me. This experience also showed me the importance of forgiveness, not just for the people who hurt me but for myself. I had spent so much time blaming myself, wondering what I had done wrong, questioning my worth. But eventually, I realized that the only way to truly heal was to forgive myself for allowing the betrayal to happen, for not trusting my instincts sooner. It wasn't about excusing their actions. It was about releasing myself from the grip of anger and self-blame. Forgiving myself allowed me to take back control, to reclaim my power, and to start the process of healing. As difficult as it was, the betrayal ultimately taught me that life doesn't always go according to plan. We can't predict the future, and sometimes the people we love the most will hurt us in ways we never imagined. But that doesn't mean we have to lose ourselves in the process. It doesn't mean we can't rebuild, heal, and come out stronger on the other side. The betrayal taught me that I am resilient, that I am capable of withstanding even the most painful storms. And most importantly, I learned that I have the power to shape my own future, to choose how I move forward, and to create a life that is filled with love, peace, and fulfillment on my own terms. Once the storm of betrayal had calmed, and I had taken the time to heal and learn from the pain, I realized that I had a choice. I could let the past continue to control me, or I could take the reins of my life and move forward. It wasn't going to be easy. Healing takes time, and rebuilding a life after such devastation requires patience, self-love, and determination. But I knew that if I wanted to create a future filled with happiness and peace, I needed to focus on what I could control. My own happiness, my own well-being, and my own growth. The first step in moving forward was accepting that life, as I knew it, had changed forever. The person I was before the betrayal could never return, and neither could the life I thought I was building with my husband and sister. And as much as I wished I could rewind time, I knew that wasn't possible. I had to make peace with the past in order to embrace the future. That meant letting go of the anger, the resentment, and the grief that had held me back. It didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It meant releasing the emotional hold it had over me. I realized that holding on to that pain only kept me tethered to the past, preventing me from moving forward. One of the most important things I did to rebuild my life was to focus on self-care. After everything I had been through, I realized that I had to start taking care of myself, both physically and emotionally. I had neglected my own needs for so long, but now I was learning to prioritize myself. I started to make time for things that brought me joy, things that made me feel good about myself. Whether it was going for walks, spending time with close friends, or just taking a quiet moment to read, I began to nurture my mind and body. I also focused on my physical health, eating well, exercising, and getting enough rest. As I started to feel better physically, I also started to feel stronger emotionally. I was reclaiming my life piece by piece, and I was learning to love myself again. But moving forward wasn't just about self-care. It was about setting new goals and creating a new vision for my life. For so long I had been defined by my relationship with my husband and sister, but now I was free to define myself. I could pursue my own dreams, explore new passions, and create a life that reflected who I was and what I truly wanted. I set new goals for myself, personal goals, career goals, and even goals for my relationships. I didn't want to simply survive. I wanted to thrive. I wanted a life that was full of purpose, joy, and peace. And I knew that in order to get there, I had to take intentional steps every day to rebuild my life and my happiness. One of the most rewarding aspects of rebuilding my life was rediscovering my own passions and interests. Before the betrayal, I had been so focused on my family and my relationships that I had forgotten about the things that truly made me happy. But now I had the time and space to explore new hobbies, interests, and activities that brought me joy. I took up painting again, something I had always loved but had put aside. I began to travel, to experience new places, and to meet new people. Each new experience was like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that life still had so much to offer. The more I invested in myself, the more I realized how much I had to offer the world. And that was a powerful feeling. Rebuilding my relationships also became an important part of moving forward. While my relationship with my husband and sister would never be the same, I began to focus on the people who truly mattered, the friends, family members, and loved ones who had supported me throughout this journey. I worked on strengthening those connections, deepening the bonds with people who respected me, who loved me unconditionally, and who valued my happiness. I learned that it's not about having a large circle, it's about having the right circle, the people who lift you up and encourage you to be the best version of yourself. In the process of rebuilding, I also realized that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting or erasing the past. The pain of betrayal, the heartache, and the lessons I learned will always be a part of my story. But they no longer define me. They are simply chapters in a much larger story. A story of resilience, of growth, and of reclaiming my life. I've learned that happiness and peace are not things that are given to you by others. They are things you create for yourself. And though the road to rebuilding has been long, I know now that I am capable of creating the life I want. One that is filled with joy, purpose, and most importantly, peace. As I look ahead, I'm excited for the future. I know there will be challenges along the way, but I also know that I am stronger than anything that comes my way. I've learned to trust myself, to love myself, and to put my happiness first. I've learned that my past doesn't have to control my future. And most importantly, I've learned that no matter what happens, I have the power to choose my own path. The betrayal was painful, but it didn't break me. It only made me stronger, and it gave me the clarity to move forward with a life that is mine to create.